Free my mother, and I will make you walk again.
What did you say?
Nobody in that courtroom expected a 9-year-old boy to be the one who changed everything. Not the lawyers, not the prosecutor smiling like he'd already won, not even the judge, who hadn't stood on his own 2 feet in 11 years. The boy's mother sat at the defense table in handcuffs, accused of a crime she didn't commit, moments from a sentence that would take her away for good. And then, in front of the entire courtroom, the boy said the one thing nobody saw coming: "Free my mother, and I will make you walk again." The room went silent. Somewhere in the back, someone laughed. But the judge didn't laugh. He leaned forward in his wheelchair, and for the first time in over a decade, something in his eyes changed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Carla Reyes had worked at Horizon Textiles for 9 years, and in all that time she had never once come home later than she promised her son. She was the kind of woman coworkers described as steady, the one who stayed late to fix other people's mistakes without ever mentioning it the next day. She had raised Daniel alone since he was 3, after his father left without so much as a note, and she had built her entire life around a simple rule. Whatever happened at work, whatever happened anywhere, Daniel would never feel the absence of a parent who cared. She packed his lunch every morning with a small drawing on a napkin. She never missed a school event. She believed, the way people who have never been truly betrayed by a system still believe, that if you did honest work and lived an honest life, the world would eventually treat you fairly in return. That belief lasted exactly as long as it took Victor Langley to decide he needed someone to blame. Victor Langley owned Horizon Textiles the way a man owns a mask, wearing it in public and removing it the moment the cameras left. To his employees, he was generous, quick with a compliment, the kind of boss who remembered birthdays. To his accountants, quietly, he was something else entirely. For 3 years, he had been running money through the company's books that had no business being there, dressing up personal transfers as vendor payments, using shell suppliers that existed only on paper. It was Carla, meticulous as always, who noticed the discrepancy first. She found it not because she was looking for it, but because a supplier invoice didn't match a delivery record, and she was the kind of person who could not let a number sit wrong on a page. She brought it to her supervisor the way she brought everything, quietly, professionally, assuming it would be handled the way anything else was handled. Her supervisor told her not to worry about it, that the account belonged to a special client with different terms. Carla nodded and let it go, the way you let go of something when you have no reason yet to believe the ground beneath you is unstable. She did not know that her question had already been reported upward, that a name had already been attached to a problem, and that the problem, from Victor Langley's perspective, was not the missing money. The problem was Carla Reyes. 3 weeks later, an internal audit discovered a pattern of falsified expense reports, all traced back to Carla's employee login. The timestamps lined up. The digital trail was clean, almost too clean, the kind of clean that only exists when someone has built it on purpose. Carla was called into a meeting she thought was routine and left in handcuffs. She did not fully understand what was happening, even as the police read her rights, because in her mind, she had done nothing except point out a number that didn't add up. She kept asking to call her son. Nobody answered that question for almost 6 hours. Daniel was at school when it happened, sitting through a math lesson he would never remember, unaware that the woman who had never once been late to pick him up was, for the first time in his life, not coming. By the time the case reached Judge Elliot Hartman's courtroom 4 months later, it had already been shaped into something simple, and simple was exactly what made it dangerous. The prosecution's story was clean. Devoted employee turns out to be a thief. Digital evidence proves it. Case closed. Prosecutor Marcus Wade built his closing arguments around the elegance of the evidence trail rather than the character of the accused, because character witnesses are messy and timestamps are not. He had done this before, more times than he let himself count, and each time it had gotten a little easier to believe that the system rewarded results more than it rewarded doubt. Judge Hartman had presided over thousands of cases from the same wheelchair he had used since a car accident 11 years earlier, an accident he rarely spoke about and had long since stopped questioning. He ran his courtroom with precision, bordering on coldness, because precision was the only thing he still fully trusted. He did not believe in miracles. He believed in transcripts, in exhibits, in the version of justice that could be measured and filed. It was this version of justice that had, quietly and without his notice, hardened into something closer to indifference. Carla's public defender, a tired but decent woman named Diane Foss, argued as hard as an overloaded caseload allowed, but she had no alibi to offer, no witness, nothing but character and disbelief, which rarely moves a courtroom on their own. The trial reached its final morning, with the outcome already understood by everyone in the room except the one person who refused to accept it. Daniel had been sitting in the gallery every day, too young by most standards to be there, too determined to be kept away. On that final morning, as the judge began reading toward a sentence, Daniel stood up before anyone could stop him and walked to the front of the courtroom. The bailiff moved to intercept him, but something in the boy's face made even the bailiff hesitate. Daniel looked directly at Judge Hartman, at the wheelchair, at the man everyone in town knew had not walked in over a decade, and said the words that would end up on every local news broadcast by nightfall. "Free my mother, and I will make you walk again." The prosecutor laughed, the kind of laugh meant to remind everyone in the room what an absurd interruption this was. Someone in the gallery laughed too. Carla, mortified and terrified for her son in equal measure, begged him to sit down, to stop exposing himself to ridicule for her sake. But Daniel did not sit down. He said it again, louder, steadier, and something about the second time landed differently than the first. Judge Hartman, who had not felt surprised by anything in a courtroom in years, found himself leaning forward in his chair instead of ordering the boy removed. He gave the boy 2 minutes before security would step in, expecting nothing more than a child's desperate performance. What he did not expect was for Daniel to say something that reframed the entire case, that his mother could not have been falsifying reports on the night in question because she had been at Grace Bellamy's house, helping her co-worker's daughter who had fallen seriously ill, and there were witnesses who could prove it. It was not admissible testimony. It was not even close to proper procedure. But it was the first thread pulled on a story that had been sewn shut a little too neatly, and Judge Hartman, almost against his own instinct, ordered a recess to have it checked. The recess Judge Hartman ordered was meant to last an hour. It stretched into the entire afternoon, because what his clerk found when she pulled the hospital and household records was not a minor inconsistency, but a hole the size of the entire prosecution's timeline. Grace Bellamy's daughter had in fact been treated for a severe asthma attack on the exact night the falsified reports were allegedly filed under Carla's login, and 3 separate records, a pharmacy pickup, a neighbor's doorbell camera, and a call log from Grace's own phone, placed Carla at that house for nearly 6 hours. It was not proof of innocence on its own, but it was proof that someone had been using Carla's credentials while Carla herself was miles away, unable to have typed a single keystroke into the system that convicted her. Prosecutor Wade felt the ground shift under him before he understood why. He had built his case on the assumption that no one would look past the login trail, because logins were supposed to be unimpeachable, the kind of evidence nobody questioned. When Judge Hartman asked him directly whether his office had verified Carla's physical whereabouts that night, Wade answered the way people answer when they are choosing their words more than their honesty, saying that physical presence was not required to execute a digital transaction. It was technically true. It was also, Judge Hartman realized as he watched Wade avoid his eyes, the sound of a man protecting something other than the truth. Diane Foss, sensing the shift for the first time in months, pressed the advantage with a question that reframed the entire case in a single sentence. If Carla was not at her desk that night, who was sitting at her workstation, using her computer, under her name? It was a question the prosecution had never been asked to answer, because until that afternoon, no one had needed an answer. The court's own security logs, when finally pulled, showed a badge swipe into the building at 11:47 p.m. under Carla's employee number. At the exact hour, 6 separate witnesses could place her 30 minutes away at Grace Bellamy's kitchen table. Judge Hartman called for a full evidentiary reopening, a decision that drew immediate and visible anger from the small cluster of Horizon Textiles executives seated in the back of the gallery, among them Victor Langley himself, who had come, he told reporters afterward, simply to see justice served. He did not smile when the recess was announced. He did not need to. Everyone who worked closely with him understood that Victor Langley's stillness was worth more attention than most men's anger, and in the back row of that courtroom, his stillness had never been more complete. Daniel was moved to a side room and given water, the bailiff's small kindness, the first gentleness any one official had shown Carla's family in 4 months. Carla, still handcuffed, reached for her son the moment they let her near him, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing yet safe enough to say. Somewhere down the hall, in a room reserved for attorneys, Marcus Wade made a phone call he would later regret making from a landline the court could trace. The subpoena for Horizon Textiles' internal server logs arrived the next morning, faster than Victor Langley expected and faster than his people were prepared for. Court investigator Paul Reyna, a quiet man who had spent 11 years learning exactly how corporate fraud liked to hide itself, found what he was looking for within hours. A remote access session initiated from an IP address registered not to Carla's home network, but to a maintenance contractor's laptop that had been issued, 6 months earlier, to a man named Curtis Bell, who worked directly under Victor Langley's finance director. Curtis Bell had no obvious motive of his own. He was, Reyna suspected almost immediately, a tool rather than an architect, someone paid or pressured into using stolen credentials on behalf of someone with far more to protect. Marcus Wade, informed of the new evidence before it became public, made the calculation that had defined every compromised decision of his career, that damage control mattered more than disclosure. He met privately with Victor Langley that evening, a meeting neither man logged anywhere, in which Langley made it plain that if the case collapsed publicly, without a controlled narrative, more than Carla's conviction would come undone. Years of falsified contracts, shell suppliers, and diverted funds sat underneath this single case, like tinder beneath a spark, and Langley intended to make sure that if anything burned, it would not be him. Judge Hartman, unaware of that meeting but increasingly unwilling to trust anything Wade presented without independent verification, ordered Carla released on her own recognizance while the reopened investigation continued, removing her handcuffs himself, in a moment that would later be replayed on local news more than any other single image from the trial. Daniel's reaction, captured by a courtroom sketch artist rather than a camera, became almost as well known. A 9-year-old boy burying his face in his mother's side as though he could physically hold the last 4 months away from ever happening again. That night, back in the small apartment they had nearly lost during Carla's suspension without pay, Daniel finally asked his mother the question he had been carrying since the day of her arrest. Had she done anything wrong, anything at all, that had made this happen? Carla told him the truth, the only truth she had, that she had noticed a number that didn't add up, and had simply asked about it out loud. It was the first time either of them fully understood that the crime that had nearly destroyed their family was not theft. It was honesty, in a place where honesty had become dangerous to certain people. 2 blocks away, in a car with the engine off, 2 men who did not work for Horizon Textiles on paper watched the apartment building for 11 minutes before driving away. What almost no one in that courtroom knew, and what Judge Hartman had spent 11 years making sure no one asked about, was that his own accident had never been fully explained even to himself. He had been a district attorney once, before the bench, working a financial fraud case tied loosely to a shell network he never finished tracing, when his car went off a coastal road on a clear, dry night with no other vehicle involved. He had accepted the official explanation, a mechanical failure, a moment of fatigue, because the alternative, that someone had wanted him stopped, was a thought too large to live inside comfortably. He built a colder version of himself after that, a judge who followed procedure exactly because procedure could not betray him the way his own instincts once had. When Paul Reyna, working the Horizon Textiles server logs late into the night, cross-referenced Curtis Bell's laptop against contractor records from 11 years earlier, he found something that made him sit back from his desk entirely. Curtis Bell's maintenance company had done work, under a different name, for a shell logistics firm that had once been investigated by a young district attorney named Elliot Hartman. The company had never been formally charged. The investigation had quietly closed the same month Hartman's car went off the road. Reyna brought the file to the judge personally, rather than filing it through normal channels, unsure whether he was handing his boss a breakthrough or a warning. Judge Hartman read it twice in silence, and something in his face changed in a way his clerks had never seen in 11 years on the bench. He did not react with anger. He reacted with the particular stillness of a man realizing that a debt he had assumed was permanently unpaid might, after all this time, still be owed. He thought of Daniel, of the boy's absurd promise made in front of a laughing courtroom, and found himself returning to it not as a child's desperate performance, but as something closer to an accusation aimed at the exact thing Hartman had spent a decade avoiding. The question of what justice cost him personally, and whether he had ever been willing to pay it. That night, for the first time since the accident, he asked his physical therapist a question he had never asked before, not what was possible, but what he would need to do to find out. Victor Langley did not panic, because men like Langley rarely allow themselves the visible symptoms of panic, but he did adjust his plans with the speed of a man who understood exactly how much exposure he was carrying. He met with Councilman Peter Doss, whose campaigns Langley had quietly funded for 6 years, through donations laundered as consulting fees, and with Police Chief Raymond Kessler, whose department had closed no fewer than 14 investigations touching Horizon Textiles over the past decade. The three men agreed, without ever stating it as plainly as this, that Marcus Wade would become the story's ending. A single compromised prosecutor, acting alone out of ambition, was a narrative the public could accept and move past. A network reaching into the council chamber and the police department was not. Wade, sensing for the first time that he had become expendable rather than protected, made the mistake of trying to protect himself instead. He recorded a private conversation with Langley without Langley's knowledge, intending to use it as leverage if he was ever asked to take the fall alone. He sent an encrypted copy to his personal attorney with instructions to release it automatically if he failed to check in within 48 hours. It was, in the end, the only honest act of his career, and it came from fear rather than conscience, which did not make it any less consequential. 2 nights later, Nurse Grace Bellamy, the alibi witness whose household records had cracked the case open, woke to the sound of someone attempting to force her back door. She escaped through a bathroom window and reached a neighbor's house before the intruders gave up and left. And by morning, Judge Hartman had ordered protective details assigned to Bellamy, to Carla and Daniel, and, after some hesitation, to himself. He understood now that the file Reyna had shown him was not a historical curiosity. It was a live wire, and Daniel's family had, without meaning to, grabbed hold of the same current that had put Hartman in his wheelchair 11 years earlier. Carla, watching an unmarked car park outside her building each night for her own protection, told Daniel the truth plainly rather than softening it, because she had learned by then that her son handled truth better than most adults. She told him that some very powerful people did not want the real story to come out, and that the coming days would require more courage from both of them than anything they had already survived. Daniel, sitting at their small kitchen table, told his mother he was not afraid, because Judge Hartman was going to do the right thing, and when people did the right thing, he said, impossible things had a way of becoming possible. 3 days later, a fisherman found Marcus Wade's body in the river, ruled an apparent suicide, with a handwritten confession letter beside him that named no one but himself. Judge Hartman entered his courtroom on the morning of the final hearing using a walker for the first time in 11 years, a fact that spread through the building before he had even reached the bench, though he had asked his staff to keep it quiet until the hearing itself. He had spent 3 weeks in physical therapy sessions he told almost no one about, driven by something he still could not fully explain to himself, except as an old debt finally being addressed. He was not naive enough to call it a miracle in the way Daniel had promised. He understood it, instead, as the direct result of choosing, for the first time in over a decade, to investigate instead of simply preside. He opened the hearing by stating plainly that the court was no longer reviewing a single embezzlement case, but a pattern of manufactured convictions stretching back at least a decade, and he called Victor Langley to the stand first. Langley arrived composed, flanked by attorneys, prepared to describe himself as a victim of internal fraud he knew nothing about. Judge Hartman, working now from Raina's full file rather than Wade's curated one, walked him through the shell suppliers, the maintenance contractor's stolen credentials, and the encrypted recording Wade's attorney had released exactly as instructed 48 hours after Wade's death. Councilman Doss was called next, forced to explain years of campaign donations traced to shell consulting firms with no employees and no offices, all linked back to Horizon Textiles through a paper trail Raina had spent 3 sleepless nights assembling. Chief Kessler followed, confronted with a list of 14 closed investigations that shared the same signature. A competent employee asked an inconvenient question, and within weeks became the accused instead of the whistleblower. Teresa Alvarez, a former Horizon accountant who had spent 2 years in prison on fabricated charges after questioning a discrepancy of her own, testified through tears about losing her marriage, her home, and 4 years of her daughter's childhood to a system that had chosen convenience over truth. A former financial journalist, Daniel Ferris, described how his career ended the moment he began investigating Horizon's contracts, accused of fabricating sources that had in fact been real and later silenced. Each testimony added a name to a pattern the courtroom could no longer dismiss as coincidence, and Langley's composed expression began, for the first time, to show the effort it was taking to maintain. The recording Wade had sent his attorney played through the courtroom speakers in near total silence, Wade's own voice, recorded weeks before his death, describing in flat and frightened detail how Langley, Doss, and Kessler had directed him to bury Carla's alibi, how similar directions had been given in at least a dozen prior cases, and how he had gone along with it because he was afraid of exactly the kind of ending he ultimately received. It was not a confession offered out of conscience. It was a man trying to survive by making himself too dangerous to disappear quietly, and it had failed to save him even as it succeeded in condemning the men who killed him. Langley's composure finally broke when Judge Hartman read the formal charges aloud: criminal conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and as the documented architects behind Marcus Wade's death, accessory to murder. Langley's attorneys objected that the recording had been obtained without consent, that the chain of evidence was contaminated, that 11 years of unrelated allegations were being unfairly bundled into a single case. Judge Hartman overruled each objection from a standing position, having risen from his wheelchair for the first time in public the moment the gallery's gasp told him everyone had noticed. He addressed Carla directly before pronouncing the court's final judgment, apologizing not for a procedural error, but for a culture that had rewarded convenient conclusions over difficult truths for far longer than this single case. He told her that her son had reminded him, in front of a laughing courtroom, of exactly why he had once wanted to become a lawyer in the first place, before fear had quietly turned him into someone who only followed transcripts. He told Daniel, seated beside his mother, that he had not simply saved his mother's life. He had saved 14 other families, whose cases would now be reopened, and he had, in a way science could not yet explain, and Hartman no longer felt obligated to explain, helped an old man remember how to stand. Langley, Doss, and Kessler were remanded into custody that afternoon, the first arrests in what would become, over the following year, one of the largest municipal corruption prosecutions the state had ever pursued. Curtis Bell, offered immunity in exchange for full cooperation, provided the final pieces investigators needed to trace nearly a decade of falsified convictions back to their source. 6 months later, in a courtroom filled for a very different reason, Judge Hartman stood without a walker for the first time, his recovery slower and more ordinary than any miracle story might suggest, built on months of physical therapy he no longer hid from anyone. He presented Daniel Reyes with the Medal of Civic Merit, the highest honor the court could offer a private citizen, for what the citation carefully described as extraordinary courage in the pursuit of truth. Daniel, older by half a year and visibly less afraid of courtrooms than he had once been, told the gathered reporters simply that he had wanted his mother back, and that good things tended to happen when people chose to do what was right, even when it was hard, even when everyone around them was laughing. Carla Reyes returned to work, not at Horizon Textiles, which had been placed under court-appointed oversight, but at a smaller company that had reached out specifically because of her reputation for honesty under pressure. Teresa Alvarez, Daniel Ferris, and 11 other wrongfully convicted men and women had their records formally cleared over the following year, each case a small, overdue correction to a system that had allowed convenience to masquerade as justice for far too long. The story of the boy who promised to make a judge walk again spread well beyond the courthouse, not because it was a miracle, but because it was a reminder people badly needed, that the truth, however long it is buried, tends to find its way back to the surface, and that the people with the least power in a room are sometimes the only ones brave enough to say what everyone else has been too afraid to. Judge Hartman, in his final public remarks on the case, said it more simply than anyone else had managed. Justice, he said, was never just about following the rules correctly. It was about having the courage to keep asking questions even when the answers were dangerous, and sometimes that courage came from the smallest person in the room.